What a marvellous party!
Indeed. Shall we dance?
Oh, I would love to!
Splendid.
The ballroom fell silent the moment Duke Evander Thorne walked in, not alone. On his arm was a girl barely 20, draped in diamonds that everyone in the room recognized. They had belonged to Duchess Celestine Thorne. Her diamonds, stripped from her jewelry box, and fastened around the throat of his mistress, like she was nothing more than a dressing mannequin to be replaced. Celestine stood at the far end of the room, her champagne glass perfectly still in her gloved hand, her spine straight as iron, her face carved from absolute composure. Not a single tear, not a flinch, just those dark, unreadable eyes watching her husband parade his young mistress across the very floors she had governed for 11 years. The whispers were vicious. Poor Celestine. He's made his choice, hasn't he? She'll be packed off to the countryside by morning. But here is what none of them knew, what no one in that glittering, gossiping room had even the faintest suspicion of. Celestine Thorne was not devastated. She was ready. Because while Evander had spent the last 6 months chasing a younger woman into his bed, his Duchess had spent those same 6 months doing something far more dangerous. Planning. And as her eyes met his across that crowded ballroom, just for one breathless second, the corners of her lips moved. Not into a smile, exactly. Into something quieter. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise for reasons he could not yet explain. He had humiliated her in front of all of society. He had taken everything from her. Her title, her dignity, her diamonds. What he did not know yet was that Celestine had decided, with the calm precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose, that she would take something from him too. Everything. His fortune, his title, his very breath if Providence allowed it. But here is the question that should be burning in your mind right now. How does a duchess in Regency America, with no legal power, no allies, and no weapons, bring down one of the most powerful dukes in the country? And more importantly, who had she already recruited to help her do it? Because that young mistress on Evander's arm, the one he trusted completely, she was not entirely what he believed her to be. If you want to find out what Celestine does next, what she has already set in motion before this night even began, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you do not miss part 2. Because I promise you, this story is only just beginning. And it is about to get very dark, very fast. Celestine Thorne had never been the kind of woman who begged for anything. Not when she was a girl of 9, watching her mother die in a bed that smelled of rosewater and regret. Not when her father, Cornelius Vane, a man more comfortable with ledgers than with daughters, sat her down the morning after the funeral and explained that her future had already been arranged. And certainly not, 11 years later, standing in a ballroom full of people who pitied her, while her husband fastened her diamonds around another woman's throat. She had been raised to endure, raised to smile when it hurt, to pour tea with steady hands when her world was crumbling, to walk into every room as though she owned the air inside it. And for 11 years, that is exactly what she had done inside the walls of Thorne House, the grandest estate in all of Alder County, with its marble floors and its oil portraits and its suffocating sense of legacy that pressed down on everyone who lived beneath its roof. She had been a good wife, not a warm one perhaps, because warmth was something Evander had never made space for, but a good one. She had managed his household with precision. She had hosted his dinners, charmed his associates, and sat beside him at every public function with the kind of quiet dignity that made other men lean toward him at the table and say, in low, approving voices, that he had chosen remarkably well. She had given him everything he asked for, and still it had not been enough. The first signs had come 8 months ago, though she recognized them clearly only in hindsight. Old coarseness at breakfast that she had told herself was fatigue. Evenings where his chair at dinner sat empty. and the butler offered explanations that were just vague enough to be suspicious. A perfume she did not wear, clinging faintly to the collar of his coat when he came home late, and the way he would walk past her without meeting her eyes, as though looking at her directly required an effort he was no longer willing to make. She had noticed. She had always noticed. But noticing and acting were two entirely different things, and Celestine had spent the better part of a decade learning when to move and when to be still. She chose stillness. She watched. She waited. And what she saw over those 8 months rearranged something deep inside her, something she could not yet name but could feel, a cold, quiet settling, like water finding its level. The girl's name was Rosalind Fitch. She was the youngest daughter of a minor family from the eastern counties. Pretty in the way that new things are pretty before the world gets its hands on them, with wide pale eyes and a laugh that carried across rooms. She was 21 years old. Celestine was 32, and if Evander Thorne had wanted the world to know which one he preferred, he had succeeded magnificently. What Celestine could not understand, in those early months of watching, was why Rosalind made her uneasy in a way that went beyond the obvious wound of betrayal. There was something behind those wide, pale eyes, something that watched back. Celestine had spent enough years studying people across dinner tables and drawing rooms to know the difference between a girl who was simply young and foolish, and a girl who was performing youth and foolishness for an audience that deserved to be deceived. Rosalind Fitch, she suspected, was performing, but for whom and toward what end she could not yet say. The person who first put the suspicion into words was not someone Celestine would have expected. Her cousin, Isadora Van, had arrived at Thorne House 3 months ago under the pretense of an extended visit. Though both women understood that Cornelius had sent her to keep watch over Celestine, the way one sends a trusted servant to guard something valuable. Isadora was 38, unmarried by choice, with a sharp tongue and sharper instincts, and she had taken one long look at Rosalind Fitch at a garden luncheon and pulled Celestine aside before the dessert course arrived. "That girl is not in love with your husband," Isadora had said, in the flat, certain tone she used when she was not offering an opinion but delivering a verdict. Celestine had looked at her steadily. "No," she agreed. "I don't believe she is." "Then what does she want from him?" It was the question Celestine had been turning over ever since, quietly, methodically, the way she turned over the household accounts each month, looking for the error, the hidden number, the place where something did not add up. Evander Thorne was not a lovable man. He was powerful and well-connected and wealthy enough that his worst qualities were perpetually forgiven by the people who needed something from him. But he was also cold, self-important, and possessed of a vanity so profound that he genuinely believed a woman 30 years his junior had fallen helplessly in love with his aging charm. He believed it because he needed to believe it. Because men like Evander Thorne required the world to confirm, constantly and elaborately, that they were worth wanting. Rosalind had understood that about him. Celestine was certain of it now. The night of the Whitmore ball, when he had walked through those doors with her diamonds on another woman's throat and the whole of society watching, Celestine had felt something inside her go very quiet, not break. She was careful, even in her own private accounting, not to call it breaking. It was more like a door closing, firmly, finally, with the particular kind of sound that tells you it will not be opened again. She had stood there with her champagne glass and her straight spine, and she had looked at her husband across the room. And she had thought, with a clarity so clean it almost felt like relief, that she was finished being still. There was a man standing near the east corridor that night. She had noticed him earlier in the evening, though she had pretended not to. His name was Calder Ashworth, and he was not exactly the sort of man one expected to find at a Whitmore ball. He was a solicitor, not of the fashionable kind, but the kind that wealthy families hired when they needed something done quietly, without the sort of documentation that could be called back into a courtroom later. He had been pointed in her direction 6 weeks earlier by Isadora, who had obtained his name through channels she declined to specify. He had done one thing for her already, a small thing, a test really, to see whether he could be trusted, and whether he was as capable as his reputation suggested. He was both, and standing there in the ballroom, watching Evander laugh at something, Rosalind whispered in his ear. Celestine had caught Calder's eye across the room. He had given her the smallest nod, almost nothing. The kind of gesture you would miss if you were not looking for it. She had looked away immediately, and taken a slow, composed sip of her champagne. It had begun. What she did not yet know, what she could not have accounted for in any of her careful, methodical planning, was that Rosalind Fitch had been watching that exchange, had seen the nod, had understood, with the instincts of someone who had been running her own silent calculations for considerably longer than Celestine realized, that the Duchess was no longer simply enduring, and Rosalind had her own plans for Evander Thorne, plans that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the Thorne fortune, the Thorne title, and the question of who would be left standing when the dust finally settled. 2 women, 1 man, and a web of intention so tangled that even the spider at the centre could not yet see all of its threads. Who do you think moves first? And when the truth about Rosalind finally surfaces, will Celestine find an enemy, or something far more complicated than that? Stay close, because part 2 is where everything begins to unravel. Celestine had expected many things from the days that followed the Whitmore ball. She had expected the whispers to grow louder. She had expected Evander to come home smelling of that perfume, and say nothing, the way he always said nothing, using silence as a weapon he never had to clean up after. She had expected the slow, grinding discomfort of pretending that her marriage was not publicly disintegrating while society watched, with the barely concealed delight of people who had nothing better to feed on. What she had not expected was Evander calling her into his study at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, and telling her, with the casual efficiency of a man dismissing a member of staff, that he intended to pursue an annulment. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. The study smelled of leather and pipe smoke, and the particular staleness of a room where important decisions were made by men who never had to live with the consequences of them. Evander was seated behind his desk, and he did not stand when she came in. That small absence of courtesy told her everything about how far they had travelled from even the performance of respect. He did not look guilty. That was the thing that struck her first. He looked inconvenienced. "You cannot be serious," she said, and her voice came out level, which surprised even her. "I am entirely serious, Celestine. The marriage has run its course." He said it the way one might say the season had turned. Inevitable, unremarkable, already decided. "On what grounds?" she asked. "Do you intend to pursue an annulment after 11 years? He shifted in his chair. "My legal counsel is handling the specifics." "Calder Ashworth," she said, and watched his face. Something moved behind his eyes. No, someone else. She believed him, and that troubled her, because it meant Evander had been planning this quietly, with his own machinery, while she had been building hers. They had been moving in parallel toward the same collision without knowing it. And the question now was not whether the impact was coming, but who would absorb the most damage when it arrived. She sat down without being invited to, and folded her hands in her lap. "You intend to annul this marriage, so you can take Rosalind Fitch as your wife?" He did not deny it. "She is 21 years old, Evander. I am aware of her age, and you are 53. "I am also aware of my own age," he said, with the first flicker of irritation. "This conversation is not a negotiation. I am informing you of a decision that has been made. You will be provided for. A suitable arrangement will be drawn up. A residence in the northern county. An annual income that is more than reasonable. given the circumstances, packed away, quietly, like something embarrassing discovered at the back of a drawer. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had shared a name and a roof, and 11 years of carefully maintained distance with, and she felt something she had not anticipated feeling in that moment. Not rage, though the rage was there underneath, slow burning and patient. What she felt, rising above everything else, was a sudden and absolute certainty. He was going to hand everything to Rosalind Fitch, the title, the fortune, the estate, all of it, transferred through marriage to a woman who Celestine was increasingly convinced did not want Evander at all, but wanted precisely what he carried. And if Rosalind was willing to marry a man she did not love in order to access his wealth and position, she was also, Celestine reasoned with a coldness that frightened her slightly, willing to do whatever came after marriage to secure it permanently. She rose from the chair. I will need some time to consult my own counsel. Of course, Evander said, already looking back at the papers on his desk, already finished with her. She walked out of that study and down the corridor, and did not stop until she reached the east sitting room, where Isidora was waiting with tea she had not yet poured, as though she had known Celestine would need a moment before she could speak. He wants an annulment, Celestine said. Isidora was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, when? He didn't specify. Celestine sat down. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were trembling slightly, not from fear but from the effort of having held them so still. He plans to marry her. Then she has moved faster than we thought. Yes, Celestine pressed her fingers flat against her knees, which means she is either more impatient than I gave her credit for, or something has changed in her timeline. Or, Isidora said carefully, she knows about you, about Calder. The room went very quiet, because if Rosalind Fitch knew that Celestine had already begun to move against Evander, then the careful, methodical plan that had felt so solid 2 days ago had a crack running straight through its centre, and cracks, in Celestine's experience, never stayed small. She reached for the tea and poured it herself, her hand steady now, through sheer force of will. Send word to Calder tonight, she said. Tell him we don't have as much time as we thought. What neither of them said aloud, but what sat between them in that quiet room like a third presence, was the question that had begun to take shape in Celestine's mind with an urgency she could no longer dismiss. If Rosalind's plan for Evander ended in marriage, that was one thing. But if it ended somewhere darker, somewhere that did not require a wedding at all, then Celestine was not simply fighting for her title and her fortune. She was in the middle of something that could get a great deal more dangerous before it resolved, and she had just made herself a visible piece on a board where she did not yet know all the players. Calder Ashworth arrived at the east entrance of Thorne House the following evening, just as the last light was leaving the sky. He came the way he always came, without announcement, without a carriage bearing any identifiable markings, dressed in the kind of unremarkable dark coat that allowed a man to move through a city without leaving an impression on anyone who saw him. Celestine had come to appreciate that quality in him more than almost any other. In a world where everyone performed their importance loudly, Calder's invisibility was its own kind of power. They met in the small library off the east corridor, a room Evander never used because it contained none of his own portraits and therefore held no interest for him. Isidora sat in the corner with a book she was not reading, her presence both a chaperone for appearances and a second set of ears that Celestine trusted absolutely. Calder did not sit. He stood near the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, and listened, while Celestine told him everything. The annulment, the timeline, the possibility that Rosalind Fitch knew more than she should. When Celestine finished, the room was quiet for long enough that the fire settling in the grate sounded loud. She knows something, Calder said finally. Not a question. Isidora believes so. I am inclined to agree. He turned from the window. In the firelight he looked older than his 40 years, not in a diminished way, but in the way of a man who had seen enough of human nature to stop being surprised by it, and had built something steady from that resignation. Then we changed the approach. What we had planned was designed for a longer timeline. If she is accelerating, we accelerate. What does that mean specifically? Isadora asked from her corner. It means we stop gathering and start moving. He looked at Celestine directly. I need you to get close to her. The silence that followed had a different quality to it. You want me to befriend Rosalind Fitch, Celestine said. I want you to let her believe you have surrendered, that the annulment has broken you, that you are no longer a threat worth watching. He said it plainly without apology, because he was not a man who softened strategies to make them more comfortable. People reveal themselves most completely to the people they believe they have already defeated. Celestine thought about Rosalind's wide pale eyes at the Whitmore ball, the way she had laughed at something Evander said while wearing diamonds that did not belong to her, the way her gaze had tracked across the room with a precision that had nothing to do with the giddy, artless girl she was performing for everyone else. She won't believe it easily, Celestine said. She is smarter than she allows people to see, which means you will have to be more convincing than you have ever been. He said it without flattery or encouragement, simply as a fact she needed to accept. Can you do that? She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, yes. She was not certain it was true, but she said it anyway, because certainty was a luxury she could no longer afford to wait for. The first step came 3 days later, engineered through Isadora's network of social connections with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent decades collecting favors from people who did not realize they were being collected. Rosalind was to attend a small afternoon gathering at the Pemberton House on the north side of the city, the kind of intimate, well-appointed event where social negotiations were conducted beneath a veneer of cake and pleasantries. Celestine arrived early, which was unusual enough to be noticed, and she made certain to be standing near the window with a composed, faintly melancholy expression when Rosalind walked in. She watched Rosalind see her, watched the brief involuntary calculation that crossed those pale eyes before the performance reassembled itself into something soft and almost sympathetic. Rosalind crossed the room toward her. Celestine had not expected her to move so quickly, and it took considerable discipline not to let that surprise show. Your Grace, Rosalind said, and her voice was gentle in the careful way of someone who had practiced gentleness until it sounded natural. I was not certain you would be here today. I hope it is not uncomfortable for you. Not at all, Celestine said, and smiled the smile she had spent 11 years perfecting, the one that was warm enough to disarm and empty enough to reveal nothing. I have found that stillness does not suit grief particularly well. One is better occupied. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Rosalind's expression. It was not sympathy, it was assessment. You are remarkably composed, she said. I think I would be devastated in your position. Perhaps, Celestine said mildly, but then you are very young. One learns, with time, that devastation is a private business best conducted away from an audience. They regarded each other for a moment across the small social distance between them, and Celestine understood with complete clarity that they were not making conversation. They were measuring, each of them taking the other's dimensions carefully, looking for the weakness, the angle, the place where pressure would produce the most useful result. Rosalind smiled first. I hope we might speak more, she said. I know the circumstances are difficult, but I have always believed that women in complicated situations understand one another better than anyone else can. It was well said. Celestine gave her that. It was the kind of thing that sounded like an olive branch and functioned as a hook. I would like that, Celestine said warmly. She returned home that evening with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been performing at a high level for several hours, and sat in the east sitting room while Isadora poured brandy neither of them particularly wanted but both of them needed. She is going to try to use me, Celestine said. Yes, Isadora agreed. The question is what for? It was Calder who provided the first real answer, and it came not from observation, but from something more concrete. He arrived 4 days after the Pemberton gathering, with a name and a set of facts that rearranged everything. Celestine thought she understood about the shape of what she was dealing with. The name was Prentice Fitch, Rosalind's older brother, a man with significant debts and a demonstrated willingness to resolve problems through means that did not survive scrutiny. Calder had connected him, through 3 careful steps of documentation, to 2 previous situations involving wealthy men of advanced age whose deaths, within a year of a significant financial arrangement, had been ruled natural by physicians who had subsequently come into unexpected prosperity. Celestine sat very still while Calder laid this out. The fire was burning low, and the room felt smaller than usual, the walls closer. She has done this before, Celestine said. Her brother has. Whether she was aware of the full extent in previous cases, I cannot say with certainty. But in this case, Calder said, I believe she is not simply aware. I believe she is directing it. The thing that Celestine felt in that moment was not fear exactly, though fear was present. It was something closer to the particular vertigo of realizing that the ground beneath a structure you have been carefully building is not what you thought it was. She had believed she was fighting a woman who wanted her husband and her title. She was actually standing inside a plan whose endpoint was a funeral. Evander's funeral. And if Evander died before the annulment was completed, the title and the fortune did not go to Rosalind. They could not without a marriage, which meant the timeline Rosalind was working to accelerate was not the annulment, it was the wedding. And after the wedding, it would not be long before Evander Thorne met with some quiet, well-managed misfortune, and his young widow would inherit everything he had spent his life accumulating, including the dignity he had stripped from Celestine, in front of an entire ballroom. How long? Celestine asked, and her voice was steady in a way she was privately proud of. Before they marry. Based on what I have been able to establish, the annulment is further along than he indicated to you. I believe they intend to marry within 6 weeks of its completion. 6 weeks. Perhaps 10 in total, not the months she had planned around. 10 weeks to dismantle a scheme that had been running longer than her own, executed by someone who had done this before, and left no bodies that could be recovered cleanly. She stood up. The brandy sat untouched on the table beside her. Then we have no more time for the slow approach, she said. Calder, I need everything you have on Prentice Fitch, documented in a form that can survive examination. Isadora, I need you to deepen the acquaintance with Rosalind on my behalf. Tell her I am struggling. Tell her I am beginning to accept the situation. Make her believe I am nearly finished. And what will you be doing? Isadora asked. Celestine moved toward the door. I am going to have a conversation with my husband. Both of them looked at her. He is in danger, she said simply. Whatever he has done to me. Whatever I have been building against him, I did not build it so that a woman with a practiced smile and a murderous brother could put him in the ground and walk away with everything wearing my diamonds. She paused at the threshold. Evander Thorne is mine to ruin, and I will be the one who decides what happens to him. Neither Calder nor Isadora spoke as she left the room. But outside the door, in the corridor's dim quiet, Celestine pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds, because the part she had not said aloud, the part that was only hers, was that somewhere beneath the strategy and the cold precision and the forward momentum of everything she had set in motion, she was frightened, not of Rosalind, not even of Prentice, of herself, of how far she was now willing to go, of the woman she was becoming in the dark space between who she had been and what this was turning her into. She opened her eyes, straightened, walked forward. There was no room left for that kind of honesty. Not yet. But it followed her down the corridor anyway, quiet and persistent like a shadow that had learned to keep pace. Celestine had not spoken privately with Evander in nearly 3 months, not genuinely, not in the way that required both of them to be present in the same conversation rather than performing around each other. What they had managed in that time were exchanges, functional and cold, the kind that kept a household running without requiring either party to look directly at the other. Walking toward his study that night felt different from every other time she had crossed that corridor. Not because she was afraid of him. She had stopped being afraid of Evander Thorne somewhere around the 4th year of their marriage, when she had understood completely that the thing he inspired was not fear but a particular kind of weariness. What made this walk different was what she was carrying with her, the knowledge about Rosalind, about Prentice, about the quiet and practiced machinery of what was coming for him, and the weight of having to decide, in the space of a corridor, how much of it to hand over and how much to keep. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. He looked up from his desk with the expression of a man interrupted, which shifted almost immediately into something more guarded when he saw it was her. "Celestine, it's late." "I know," she said, and closed the door behind her. She did not sit this time. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him steadily and said, "I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to do it without interrupting, because what I am about to tell you is not a manipulation or an attempt to delay the annulment. I need you to understand that before I begin." Something in her tone reached him. She could see it. He sat back slowly. "Go on," she told him. "Not everything." She was careful about what she withheld, the full extent of what Calder had built, the documentation, the depth of her own planning against him. Those she kept behind her teeth. But she gave him Prentice Fitch. She gave him the 2 previous men. She gave him the physicians and the pattern and the timeline that pointed, with a clarity that could not be reasoned away, toward what Rosalind intended to happen after a wedding ring made her claim on the Thorne estate legally unassailable. She watched his face while she spoke, the skepticism that lived there at the beginning moving through something more complicated as she continued, his jaw tightening, a stillness coming over him that she recognized as the particular stillness of a proud man, receiving information that threatens the architecture of a belief he has organized his recent life around. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "You are lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and they both heard it. "I am not," she said simply. "I have never lied to you, Evander. That was always your direction, not mine." The words landed. She had not meant them as a weapon exactly, but she had not softened them either, and they sat between them with the particular weight of true things spoken plainly, after too long a silence. He stood up from the desk and moved to the window, his back to her, and she could see the tension across his shoulders, the effortful processing of a man whose vanity was at war with his survival instinct. She understood what it cost him to stand there and consider that the young woman who had made him feel chosen and vital and young again had selected him the way one selects a vehicle, entirely for where it could take her, and had been planning to discard him the moment the journey was complete. "If this is true," he said, without turning around, "it is true. Then why are you telling me?" He turned then, and his face had shed something, some of the habitual coldness, and underneath it he looked older than she had ever seen him look, and not entirely unlike the man she had agreed to marry 11 years ago, before they had done what they had done to each other. "You have every reason to let this play out. If she removes me, the annulment dies with me, and your position is secured." It was not a simple question. She had asked it of herself 100 times in the corridor walking here. Why was she telling him? The strategic answer was that she needed him alive and functional to serve the purposes of what came next. That was true. But it was not the whole truth, and she was tired, in that particular moment, of living exclusively inside strategy. Because, whatever you have done, she said, you do not deserve to be murdered in your own bed by a woman who was never there for any reason except your fortune. You deserve to answer for what you did to me in that ballroom, and in the years before it, in ways that are honest and real and that you actually have to face. Death is not an answer. It is an escape. She held his gaze. I am not finished with you yet, and I will not let her finish you for me. The silence that followed was the most honest one they had shared in years. Then Evander did something she had not anticipated. He lowered himself back into his chair, and for a moment he simply looked at his hands, and he said, very quietly, I have been a fool, not an apology. She did not expect one, and she would not have known what to do with it if it came. But it was something. A crack in the stone of him, small and perhaps temporary, but real. Yes, she said. You have. She moved toward the door. Her hand was on the frame when he spoke again. What do you need from me? She stopped, did not turn around immediately, gave herself one breath to absorb the strangeness of that sentence coming from that man in that room. Then she turned. Stop the annulment proceedings. Tell no one why, and stay away from Rosalind Fitch for the next 72 hours, without giving her any reason to suspect that something has changed. And after 72 hours. After that, Celestine said, it will no longer be your problem to manage. She left him there with the fire burning low and the weight of the evening settling around him, and she walked back down the corridor with the strange and complicated feeling of someone who has just sacrificed the clean satisfaction of an enemy's downfall in order to do something that cost considerably more. She had protected him, the man who had humiliated her in front of everyone she knew. She had protected him, and it had required her to reach past every justified wound and every careful plan and choose something harder than revenge. She was not certain it was the right thing. She was not certain it was nobility or strategy, or simply the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to let anyone else write the ending of her own story. But it was done, and the next 72 hours would tell her whether it had been enough. The 72 hours passed the way certain unbearable things pass, not quickly, not cleanly, but with the grinding slowness of a clock that you are watching too carefully. Celestine did not sleep well. She did not expect to. She lay in the large, quiet bed that had been hers alone for longer than she cared to calculate, and she stared at the ceiling, and she ran through every variable, every possible fracture point in what Calder had constructed, every place where something could come loose and take everything down with it. She had spent 11 years being still and patient, and now that she was finally moving, the waiting felt almost physically painful, like a wound that had been held closed by pressure, and was being asked to hold itself together unaided. Calder had moved the moment she returned from Evander's study. She had sent word within the hour. And he had spent the following 2 days doing what he did with a quiet, methodical precision that she had come to rely on the way one relies on a well-made instrument, trusting it entirely, because it had never yet failed the task she put it to. The documentation on Prentice Fitch, cross-referenced against the 2 previous cases, organized and verified, and placed into the hands of a magistrate whose integrity Calder had established through careful inquiry long before it was needed. That was the thing about Calder. He prepared for the next step before the current one was finished. Prentice Fitch was taken into custody on the morning of the 3rd day. Celestine heard about it from Isadora, who came into the east sitting room with her coat still on, and her expression carrying the particular controlled energy of someone delivering significant news while trying not to appear to be doing so. She sat down. She told Celestine what she knew. The magistrate's men had gone to Prentice's lodgings at dawn and found, in addition to Prentice himself, a collection of materials that Calder's documentation had told them precisely where to look for, the kind of materials that removed ambiguity from the situation entirely. "And Rosalind?" Celestine asked. Isidora's expression shifted into something more complicated. She was at Thorne House when word reached her. Evander's butler sent for me directly, as you asked. A pause. She did not run. That surprised me. It surprised Celestine too, and she turned it over carefully. A woman who did not run, when her mechanism of operation was dismantled, was either very frightened or very calculated, and she had learned enough about Rosalind Fitch to know that fear alone was unlikely to be what kept her standing still. She went to Thorne House herself that afternoon. It was the first time she had entered it in any purposeful capacity since the night of the Whitmore ball, and the familiarity of it struck her strangely. The marble floors and the portraits and the particular quality of light through the east windows that she had spent 11 years knowing without ever quite calling home. Evander met her in the entrance hall, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which she suspected was accurate, and who had spent that time performing a rapid and uncomfortable rearrangement of his understanding of recent events. He said nothing when he saw her, just stepped aside and let her pass, which was its own kind of communication. Rosalind was in the drawing room. She was seated perfectly upright in the chair nearest the window, her hands folded, her face composed into an expression that was either genuine calm or the most accomplished performance Celestine had ever witnessed. When Celestine entered, she looked up, and for the first time since Celestine had begun watching her, the performance was absent. What remained was something stripped and direct and considerably more interesting. "You did this," Rosalind said. Not an accusation exactly, almost an acknowledgement. "Yes," Celestine said, and sat down across from her. The silence between them had a different texture from their previous ones. All the careful social scaffolding was gone. They were simply two women in a room, looking at each other honestly, for perhaps the first time. "My brother," Rosalind said, and something moved briefly across her face that looked unexpectedly like grief. "Is he? He is in custody. He will be tried." Celestine kept her voice even. "The evidence is complete." Rosalind closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had shifted, not broken exactly, but reoriented, like a compass finding north after being held too close to something magnetic. "I did not instruct him to," she said quietly. "The previous men. I did not know the full extent of it until it was done. I want you to know that, though I understand it changes nothing." Celestine looked at her for a long moment. The honest part of her, the part that had watched Rosalind with such careful attention across so many rooms, believed her. Not entirely, not without reservation, but enough to sit with the possibility that the picture was more complicated than a simple villain and her scheme. "It changes something," Celestine said finally. "Not everything, but something." Rosalind was removed from Thorne House that evening, not by the magistrate's men, but quietly, arranged by Calder, who had a capacity for managing exits that left people with their dignity approximately intact. What happened to her after that was a question that Celestine deliberately left partially open, following at a distance but not closing the door entirely, because she had learned enough in these months to understand that certainty about people was almost always premature. Evander did not contest the reversal of the annulment proceedings. He signed what Calder put in front of him, and he did it without theatre, which was the closest thing to grace she had ever seen from him. He did not apologize. She did not ask him to. There were conversations still ahead of them, long and uncomfortable ones, about what the marriage was now, and what it could or could not become. But those conversations existed in a future she had not yet arrived at, and she had learned painfully and thoroughly not to plan too far ahead of where she actually stood. What she had, standing in the entrance hall of Thorne House on a grey afternoon, with the portraits watching and the marble cold underfoot, was the thing she had fought for, not the neat, satisfying conclusion she had imagined in the early days of planning. Something messier and more honest than that. Her name intact, her position restored, a husband who had looked at himself briefly, with something approaching clarity, and the knowledge settled deep and permanent that she had moved through the worst of it without losing the part of herself that she most needed to keep. She retrieved her diamonds herself, not dramatically. She simply went to the jewellery case in her dressing room, and they were there, returned without ceremony, and she held them in her palm for a moment and thought about the night they had been fastened around another woman's throat while a room full of people decided she was finished. She was not finished. She had never been finished. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to make that known, and she had made it known in the only way that counted, not with spectacle, not with rage, with precision and patience, and the willingness to protect even the people who had hurt her when protecting them was the right thing to do. She set the diamonds back in the case and closed the lid. Outside, the light was changing, thin and pale, the particular quality of early afternoon moving towards something warmer, the kind of light that did not promise anything dramatic but suggested, quietly, that the day was not yet done. She was not yet done either. 3 weeks after Prentice Fitch was taken into custody, a small envelope arrived at Thorne House, addressed in handwriting that Celestine did not immediately recognize. It was delivered not through the main entrance but through the east door, the same door Calder used, which meant someone had known to bring it that way. That detail alone made her sit down before she opened it. Inside was a single card, no signature, 4 words written in a careful, controlled hand that she recognized, after a moment, as Rosalind's. It said, "He was not alone." Celestine read it twice, then she set it on the table in front of her and looked at it for a long time without moving. Calder arrived within the hour, because she had learned by now that certain things required him to be in the room. She handed him the card without preamble and watched his face while he read it. The expression that crossed it was not alarm exactly, but it was close enough to make her chest tighten. "She means Prentice had a partner," he said. "That is what I understood. Someone inside this house, or outside it." "I don't know," Celestine said. "But she knew to send this through the east door, which means she knows enough about my arrangements to have been watching them, which means she has been watching me for longer than we accounted for." The silence in the room took on a different weight. They had believed, with the confidence of people who had executed a careful plan successfully, that the situation was contained. Prentice in custody, Rosalind removed, Evander restored to something approximating caution, the machinery of the threat dismantled. But a machine with a hidden component is not dismantled. It is merely quieted, and quiet, Celestine had learned, was not the same as finished. She stood up and moved to the window. Outside, the grounds of Thorne House spread in the pale autumn light, formal and manicured, and entirely still. She had looked at those grounds 10,000 times, from 10,000 different windows, and they had always looked like order, like permanence, like the world held in place by the right arrangements. They looked different now. They looked like a surface. "Find out who Prentice was communicating with in the weeks before he was taken," she said. "Every contact, every meeting. I want to know who else knew what he was planning and chose not to prevent it." "That could take time," Calder said. "Then begin today." He left quickly in the way he left when the task was urgent, without ceremony, without the small professional courtesies that filled the ends of less pressing conversations. Celestine remained at the window after he was gone, and she allowed herself, briefly, the thing she rarely allowed in front of anyone, including herself. She was tired, not the tiredness of a single difficult night, but the accumulated exhaustion of months of vigilance, of performing competence and composure, while carrying, underneath it all, the constant low hum of fear and uncertainty, and the particular loneliness of being the only person in any room who understood the full picture of what was happening. She had won. She knew she had won, and yet the card on the table behind her suggested that winning had simply opened the next door rather than closing the last one. Isadora found her there 20 minutes later and said nothing for a while, simply stood beside her at the window, in the comfortable silence of a woman who had known Celestine long enough not to fill quiet with unnecessary sound. "You are thinking about leaving," Isadora said eventually. Celestine looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because you have that expression. The one you had when you were 17, and your father told you about Evander. And you spent 3 days looking at the road outside the house, as though you were calculating the distance to somewhere else." Isadora turned to face her fully. "Are you?" Celestine considered the question honestly. Leaving, the word had a texture to it that she was surprised to find was not entirely unappealing. Thorne House, with its portraits and its marble, and its weight of everything that had happened inside its walls. Evander, who was being careful with her now in the way of a man who understood he was on uncertain ground and was trying, in his limited and largely graceless way, to navigate it without causing further damage. The social world of Alder County, which had watched her humiliation with such appetite, and would now watch her restoration with equal interest, neither chapter of which had anything to do with who she actually was. "I am thinking," she said carefully, "about what I want, which is something I have not done with any real honesty in a very long time." "And what do you want?" She did not answer immediately. Outside, a bird crossed the grey sky above the formal garden and disappeared beyond the tree line, and she watched it go with the particular attention of someone who is not really watching a bird at all. What she wanted was complicated by everything she now knew about herself. She had discovered, in the months of planning and moving and fighting, that she was considerably more capable than the life she had been living required her to be. That was both liberating and faintly devastating, in the way that all late discoveries carry a shadow of what might have been different had they arrived sooner. She had a mind that worked with precision under pressure. She had instincts that had proven reliable. She had a tolerance for moral complexity that went beyond simple categories of right and wrong, and allowed her to operate in the grey spaces where most people either froze or made catastrophic errors. She had also discovered that she could protect someone she had every reason to abandon. That had surprised her more than anything. It suggested there was a version of herself she had not yet fully met. Something beyond the enduring wife and the strategic survivor. Something that made choices from a deeper place than calculation. "I want to be useful," she said finally, "in ways that are real, not decorative." Isadora studied her for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved in the way it did when she was arriving at something she had already been thinking for considerably longer than the conversation suggested. "Calder has spoken to me," she said carefully, "about other situations. Other women in positions not unlike the one you were in 3 months ago. Women with resources and intelligence, and no legitimate avenue through which to deploy either." Celestine turned to look at her fully. "He believes," Isadora continued, "that someone with your particular combination of social position and demonstrated capability could be, in the right circumstances, extraordinarily useful to people who have no other recourse." The room was very quiet. "He wants me to do this again," Celestine said. "Not for yourself, for others." She sat with that for a long moment. The exhaustion she had felt 10 minutes ago was still present, but it had shifted slightly, the way pain sometimes shifts when it is given a direction to move toward. She thought about the women she had sat across from at 100 dinner tables and drawing rooms and afternoon gatherings. Women with composed faces and steady hands and eyes that held, if you knew how to look, the same careful calculations she had been running for 11 years. How many of them were surviving rather than living? How many of them had no Isadora, no Calder, no accumulated resource of intelligence and position that could be turned, carefully and strategically, towards something better than endurance? "It would not be safe," she said. "No," Isadora agreed. "It would not." "And Evander?" "That," Isadora said, "is a conversation only you can have with yourself." That evening, Celestine went to Evander's study for the second time in recent memory, and the atmosphere between them was different from every previous version of itself. He looked up when she entered, and this time he did stand, which she noted without comment. She told him simply and directly that she intended to remain at Thorne House and to continue as his Duchess in all the formal and social capacities that the role required. She also told him that she intended to occupy her time in ways that she would not be detailing to him, and that she expected, in return for her continued presence and the management of his household and his social reputation, a degree of autonomy that their marriage had never previously included. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him weighing it, the man he had been against the situation he was now in, the vanity against the practicality, the habit of control against the knowledge of what that control had nearly cost him. "All right," he said. 2 words, quietly spoken, but they rearranged the architecture of 11 years, and both of them understood it. She returned to her own rooms and sat at the small desk near the window where the light came in correctly, and she thought about Rosalind's card, still sitting on the table in the east sitting room. He was not alone. The thread that had not yet been pulled, the door that had not yet been opened, there was still something out there. Someone who had known enough to be dangerous, and had chosen to remain hidden while Prentice was taken, and Rosalind was removed. Watching, waiting, calculating their own next move. She picked up a pen. She began to write, not to Calder, not to Isadora, to someone she had been considering for 3 weeks, a woman in the western counties, whose name had come to her through a circuitous route that she had not yet fully traced, but whose situation bore certain familiar marks. A woman with resources she could not access, and intelligence she had no outlet for, and a life that had been arranged entirely around someone else's requirements. Celestine knew what that felt like. She knew it with the complete and embodied knowledge of someone who had lived inside it for 11 years. She wrote carefully. She said very little in the words themselves, because she had learned that the most important communications were the ones that said just enough and no more. She said she had heard something of the woman's situation. She said she believed she might be in a position to help. She said she would welcome a response if one was forthcoming. She sealed it and set it aside for Calder to deliver through the channels that left no traceable path. Then she sat back and looked at the window and the darkening sky beyond it, and she felt, underneath the tiredness and the unresolved questions and the particular uncertainty of a life that had been cracked open and rebuilt into something she did not yet fully recognize, the faint and genuine warmth of something she had almost forgotten she was allowed to feel. Purpose, clear and directed and entirely her own. She had come into this as a woman being erased. She was leaving it as something she did not yet have a name for, but which was hers, built from everything that had tried to diminish her and had failed. The game, she understood now, was not over. It had simply changed shape, and she was only just beginning to learn its new rules. Thank you so much for staying with Celestine through every twist, every silence, and every moment she chose herself over surrender. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath, whispering wait, what, or simply refusing to look away, then you already know what this channel is about. There is so much more coming. More women who refuse to be erased. More rooms where the wrong person underestimated the quietest person present. Do not miss what comes next. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell and stay close. The next story is already waiting, and I promise you, it begins exactly where you least expect it.